So we're going to start out. I will bring on Matt Metzger from Barr Engineering. He's going to talk about our update to the long-term flood solutions. We've been working on that for a long time, and in 2022 is when we'll be closing out that project, and he'll share the status of that. So as long as you're there, Matt.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks attendees for the opportunity to share this update with you for the long-term flood solutions study. This work's been going on for the last few years, 2021 through 2020 through 2021 and into this year. And Matt Metzger from Barr Engineering, I'm the project manager for moving this forward. We have a large team that involves Corps of Engineers, other consultants. So I'm speaking on behalf of a much larger team that's been moving this forward for several years. And the study extent for this work is the US portion of the basin, which you see on your screen there. This study, if you've heard us give updates in the past, been happening since 2011. The first study and this update have been happening since 2011. The lens of this study is broader assessment of flood risk and using newer available data to understand basin-wide vulnerabilities that we can work to build resilience against community by community, resident by resident. It takes a long-term view, looking at regular updating with the latest and greatest hydrology data throughout the basin and our latest and greatest understanding of what flood risks are existing and emerging basin-wide. So it's part checkup and part preventive medicine, I'd say. Thank you, audience members who have provided resources to make this possible. It's funded 50% at the local level by the groups you see here on the screen. Thank you for your assistance, contributions, your input. The other 50% is provided by Corps of Engineers, which was secured in 2019. I'll say that one grant on that for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, which is shown there, the subset scope of work that was related to completion and closeout of that grant was completed in the summer of 2021. So that was an important milestone. We made it across this last summer. So thank you to all of our funding partners who are watching and listening today. On the note about the team, the Red River Basin Commission leads this and provides the oversight, facilitation, and connects this team up with the funding sources and the scope of work. The technical work is generally split between our team along with April Walker Consulting. I believe you're going to hear from April Walker briefly tomorrow as a presenter. And the other half is provided with technical support from Corps of Engineers technical teams. There is a complementary piece of local work which is also ongoing for looking at retention storage impacts downstream of Halstead. That similarly is a split federal and local effort, and you should be hearing later this afternoon from local consultant Zach Herman on the status of that downstream retention storage study. So the goal, again, basin-wide US portion, a snapshot of what do we know about flood risk and what are the emerging issues considering the latest and greatest data. The Basin Commission doesn't hold any role in making decisions for communities or making regulations. The study is aimed at empowering local decision makers to make decisions for their communities and their community's best interest with best available data. The study aims to capture our best available information related to 10-year, 100-year, 200-year, 500-year protection levels. The spirit of the long-term flood study has, from the beginning, been to encourage increasing levels of protection the larger the community the flood protection system is protecting. So from 10 years at agricultural properties up to 500 years at the major urban areas in the basin. And this is a little bit different than using just a single, it's a lot different than using just a single 100-year floodplain insurance standard as one elevation across the board for all properties, regardless of risk behind the system. So this requires us to look at a variety of scenarios. You've heard kind of probably a consistent theme this morning that as we look at larger events and variation in flood risk, that it's a lot of it is about scenario building and look at a range of possible futures, a range of possible flood scenarios to better understand what's the range of risk to help communities prepare for that. So with this broader assessment of flood risk, it is basin-wide, but ultimately implementation is local, and the information that will be provided in this flood study update is aimed at not just riverine flood levels, but also extreme precipitation uncertainty, which affects community infrastructure, interior drainage systems. It introduces risks to private business-owned infrastructure. When you consider precipitation in conjunction with river levels, that can have impact on groundwater levels. The long-term flood study will look to summarize that range of risk. I'll call them risk actors. That can affect everything from emergency routes to supply chains, water wells, property, critical infrastructure, ag land inundation and duration. These are all issues of concern, and the ultimate aim of this study is to better prepare communities and residents with the information they need to effectively update any gaps or shortcomings they can identify in their emergency action plans, local ordinances, or levels of protection. So, to that end, we have 4 primary technical tasks. We are about 2/3 of the way through this technical work. Thank you to those in the audience who have been a technical advisory committee for the last round. We'll be resuming technical advisory committee review work probably again this spring, so keep an eye out for that if you've been involved with that and you're in the audience again. Task 1 and 2 are very related to runoff and river hydrology updates, looking at flows and stages with more recent data, sensitivity with updated periods of record, considering, well, if we look at a wet period of record versus a dry period of record versus full period of record, how might climate change factor into uncertainty with flood risk and confidence limits, and looking at some of the variations with soil moisture, snowmelt. What are the factors that lend confidence or increase uncertainty with our assessment of flood risk, both from river and from extreme single event, extreme precipitation events. Task 3 takes current levels of protection and compares them back to that more updated flood risk information with the goal of looking for any gaps, help communities identify any places where they can increase their resilience to those risks. And task 4 is a basin-wide checkup on floodplain management policy, regulation review, and best practices throughout the basin. There was a presentation on that topic at last year's virtual conference, if you had the chance to see that. As part of that task 4 and the climate change sensitivity review, our team looked at a canvassing of basin-wide published guidance from entities you see here on the screen. Those entities are throughout North Dakota, Minnesota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and elsewhere. If you're in the audience and you helped create any of these reports, thank you for your efforts. It definitely helps us look for not necessarily consensus, but look for patterns across the basin and what are similar themes that are emerging from different agencies, so we can begin to put that together for a more complete picture of what we think the basin-wide risks are, where our floodplain regulations could perhaps use bolstering, and where perhaps climate change risk is introducing new kinds of risk for flooding that in the past we may have overlooked. To that end, we looked at 4 major themes in the, referring to just the climate change summary piece of that. We looked at 4 major themes related to changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, commentary on riverine flooding, commentary on changes in the landscape, so soil moisture, snowpack, tiling, etc. This table is just a snapshot summary of us doing pattern identification across those themes, and down the left side you see that column, which is a little bit hard to read, but it's the year of the individual report. So those columns in that table are summarized with those 4 headings at the top. But what you see there is we went through the literature and coded what we read as pattern for the individual study. And if it was red, orange, it represented a increasing trend across the basin, or at least for the study that we were reading. And if it's gray or white, it was inconclusive. And if it was green, it showed a decreasing trend. So this doesn't help us necessarily achieve consensus that everybody is saying the same thing, but it does help us identify trends in the literature and help us identify what patterns of commentary are starting to align, where groups throughout the basin are seeing similar things based on the data that they're looking at. So to summarize that table a little bit more simply, in terms of temperature, the literature is indicating, increased risk of rising temperature across all 4 seasons, but especially noticeable in winter. Similarly, increased precipitation winter, spring, and fall. Every year is different, but there's a mixed signal for summer, where there's a clear signal that extreme precipitation from individual events is of increasing risk, which pertains particularly to community drainage systems, individual interior drainage systems, pumping stations, ditching systems for individual communities, and community freeboard requirements. The second 2 columns of riverine flooding and the impacts of the landscape are much more mixed signals. And listening to the presentations this morning, the presenters were diving into the nuances and the particulars of those 2 interacting sets of factors, and how every fall soil moisture and spring snowmelt season is different. That sets up different riverine flooding conditions every single year. So in terms of trying to identify a pattern of what risk is introduced by climate change for that riverine flooding and those changes on the landscape, right now, what we looked at and what we're hearing from a number of researchers is that it is a mixed signal. We have more work to do to understand that better. Some of those factors can reinforce each other and could drive greater levels of flooding on tributaries or the main stem. And there might be sets of factors where they offset each other, where because of fall moisture or spring snowmelt and the way the thaw progression goes, it perhaps offsets additional precipitation accumulated on the landscape. So those factors can reinforce or offset each other. And in terms of climate change, there's more work to do for us to all understand basin-wide how that changes our risk or our confidence in making predictions. Well, that comes on the heels of what you heard from Weather Service and the speakers this morning. The important thing there is, going into the future, we'll have to continue working on this and monitoring and gathering up this data to continue to recognize those shifting vulnerabilities that help basin-wide and local decision makers ask better questions and continue to prepare for their community for the changing conditions in the future. So we all have to stay on our toes there. Similarly, that basin-wide literature review for floodplain regulations, that was a checkup on the status of best practices, what protection levels are throughout the basin, regulations looking for if there's looking for patterns and what regulations and what freeboard setback floodplain regulations are being enacted and implemented by communities. Where are there any gaps? That was a presentation again at last year's virtual conference, and that will be a portion of the content that's in the LTFS study update here in 2022. So to summarize schedule, been working on this for a couple of years, wrestling with challenges of the pandemic and coordination among a number of groups, but we are 2/3 of the way through our progress towards the final report. So wrapping up this year is the bulk of the H&H, will be the bulk of the H&H updates related to discharge and frequency, the 200-year, 500-year hydrographs, sensitivity due to climate change, Atlas 14, rainfall period of record, etc. And then comparing that back to assess the risk at individual communities. The floodplain management work was completed in 2021. That work will be folded into the final LTFS update report here in 2022. And the ongoing task at the moment with Corps of Engineers and the local consultants, depending on the timing of folding in that flood risk reduction, plus the potential benefits of that for 200 and 500-year floods in the downstream, using retention storage in the downstream half of the basin, depending on the timing of when that information is made available, will depend on if and how it becomes part of this update of the long-term flood study. But it's important to continue to think of it as a kind of a living piece of work, because newer information is always emerging, and our understanding of the basin and flood risk is always changing. And the basin can look forward to revisiting it again in the future with better, more current information. So for everybody out there in the audience, thank you for contributing any data, insights, reports that we've have been using and will use to make this report update. It really is a basin-wide effort to make these regular updates and maintain kind of best available snapshot of flood risk in this US portion of the basin, so we can understand our vulnerabilities and how best to address those vulnerabilities.